This is called the Christian Hall of Fame, and it's about people who've made a difference in our culture and in our lives in ways that we don't appreciate. But I'm going to also talk, it's not going to be a history lesson. There's important ideas that they've introduced that we need to be aware of, and I think really make an impact. We live in tumultuous times. The foundations that we've all assumed for decades are being eroded, and we think there'll be no adverse effects. I think of an old Kansas farmer I knew in Newton that said, "Don't tear down no fence until you understand why they put it up to start with." And I think we are in a historical spasm of fence tearing right now. And there's going to be adverse effects. One of the foundational beliefs that's being challenged is the existence of God. We are told that we no longer have a need for God. Marx told us that religion is an opiate for the masses. Portions of the atheistic community tell us that there's no evidence for God, thus there's no God. We do not need a God to explain how everything came into being, and we're told by both portions of the scientific community and some in the Christian community, unfortunately, that science and faith stand opposed to each other. That's just not true. Some of you have heard of George Washington Carver. He saw no problem with being a Christian and a scientist. In fact, he testified repeatedly that his Christian faith was the only mechanism by which he could effectively pursue science. He believed that God provided everything that people needed, but it was up to humanity to discover the secrets hidden within each plant, animal, mineral, and how it can be used. The whole scientific enterprise began with faith. If the world is the product of a rational God, if the world is the product of a creator, then through a relationship with the creator, we can study the processes that the creator created. And we can follow the mind of God and see what is up. Our first inductee into the Christian Hall of Fame this morning is a person you've heard of. His name is Galileo. And while we're going to talk about Galileo, it's also we're going to talk about other people besides him in the Christian scientific community. I'm reading out of Psalms chapter 19, verses 1 through 6. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens God has pitched a tent for the sun. It is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. And nothing is deprived of its warmth. I use this verse for a couple reasons. The first is that initial refrain. The heavens declare the glory of God. But also that last one. The sun rises at one end and makes its circuit to the other, and yet we're told that no one in the church, no one of faith, ever conceived of a circular orbit or a circular earth, and yet there it is in Psalms. Let me talk about Galileo just for a second. Galileo is famous for the supposed friction he had with the church. Galileo on one side representing science, battling against Christianity and battling against faith. And it's at this point I think we need to be reminded of a couple different truths. The first one is this. Galileo never abandoned his faith. In fact, he said it's his faith that drove him. Here's a quote here that says, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use." I think he's right. One of the other quotes of Galileo is this: "God is known in nature by the works of his hands." And I think that's also true. Yet we live in this time and place where we think that science and faith battle each other. And they don't. There's something that Galileo said hundreds of years ago that we would do well to remember today, and that's this. He said, the Bible teaches humanity how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. And I think that's right. I've often reminded people, the people who wrote Genesis were alive thousands of years ago, and they made some interesting observations that were perfectly understandable. If you read the creation story in Genesis, it says God divided the waters above from the waters beneath. The waters beneath he called the sea. The waters above he called the sky. You can read it in Genesis. And they go, well, that doesn't make any sense. Until you think about it. If I go to the edge of Lake Michigan today, and I look at the blue sky, and I look at the blue water, and I know the water's blue, and the sky is blue. Therefore, and to further prove that fact, when a storm comes up, and the wind builds up, and there's thunder, and lightning cracks the sky, guess what falls out of the sky? Rain. So they made this connection. They were not operating from a scientific basis. They were operating out of an observational basis and out of a faith basis. Who are we? What is important? Not a science textbook. To the people of faith, Galileo gave another warning that I think is good to remember today. It's a terrible detriment for souls if people find themselves convinced by proof of something that it was made then a sin to believe. That's powerful. Another quote is, people who are unable to understand perfectly both the Bible and science far outnumber the people who do understand them. I think that's true. And it's equally true for both science and the Bible. Later, he said, it is much more pleasant to gain a reputation for wisdom without effort or study than to consume oneself tirelessly in the most laborious disciplines. And there are a lot of people who live that way, who claim wisdom and do very little study and very little digging and background work necessary. I had just, some of you saw, I posted a couple weeks ago, in the week after the semester ended, one of the things that happens, students fill out this student evaluation of the professor. And I get about a week or two after it's available before I read it. It gives me some distance, and even though I do, every single one I've ever had is remarkably the same. There's always, on one end, there's always quite a lot of strongly agree and support, and there's always two people. I'm dumb, I know nothing, everything is bad. Well, one of them, and I don't think it was one of the negative, one of them, it might have been, when asked to give a general comment about the Bible course, said, when I took the course, I was expected to be told how to interpret the Bible. Instead, all we heard is about history, context, politics, family, economics, and what the world was like 2,000 years ago. And for that I said, you're welcome. They've been listening. Because you have to do some work in history and economics and politics and background and all those things to know what to do with things. As I told people, if I walked into a room and I said, all right, I heard a good one this week, knock, knock. And you go, who's there? Who taught you that? Well, you just kind of grew up with it. You just know. I told a joke to my wife 2 weeks ago. My wife shook her head. She said, it's a terrible joke. Never say it in public, so I'm going to do it this time. The joke is, I learned very early in elementary school that German kids just weren't that smart. Because we had a kid in our class who was German, and the teacher kept asking him if he knew what the square root of 81 was, and he kept saying no. And anyway, we're moving on. Some of you get that. Some of you over lunch will understand that.
Don't ever tell it again.
She was right. I just thought I'd share it. He didn't listen. I asked my wife this week if we could make some alligator tonight for taco night. She goes, no, we don't have a crock pot. See, that's a different one too. So it just gets worse. See, it gets worse. Those are from the Dad Joke Hall of Fame. When we have the Bible does something specifically. It tells us who we are, why we are, what our relationship is supposed to be like with the Creator, where we find value, where we find worth. All those questions are answered. If you want to know how many million miles the sun is from the earth, the Bible's not the place to look. If you want to go to a science textbook, you can find all those things. But you won't find questions of value and worth there. Even hundreds of years ago, Galileo correctly identified supernovas as distant stars. He discovered and named the largest 3 moons of Jupiter. His observation that Venus exhibited a set of phases like the moon tore down the idea that the earth was at the center of everything and confirmed that everything revolved around the sun. He also observed sunspots. He's the first to observe Neptune. And actually was the first person to realize that the spots on the moon was not a face, but actual shadows and sunlight of topographical features, and was able to estimate the height of the mountains of the moon probably fairly accurately from a distance. Galileo's not the only one. I give you Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton made a book in 1687 called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy that is still in use today. Newton's faith was as odd and conspicuous at his time as was his work. He was a devout Christian. While he set out as a scientist to explain the universe, he warned against using science to view the universe as a lifeless machine. He said, gravity explains the motions of the planets, but it cannot explain the one who set the planets in motion. God governs all things and knows all that is or can be done. And when people around him said, your explanation of gravity cancels the need for God, Newton posited that gravity does not cancel that need, but is simply an observation of one of the sustaining forces that God has designed. In our time, there's a historian named Joseph Needham who is actually a Marxist professor from Oxford. And he wrote that you got to a point in history where all the technology of the Eastern world and the Muslim world with the Western world was equal. But the difference why one was able to make advancements in science is the only difference is that the East did not have the concept of a single, rational, logical creator who created all things. Therefore, there was no need to get behind and do some study to find the logic, rational mind that's behind everything. But I don't want to just talk about history. I want to talk about science and faith. There's a man named Francis Collins. Some of you might have heard. He's the director of the National Institutes of Health right now. who was the director and the driver of the National Genome Project that charted all the sequences on the DNA strands, which we'll get to in a second. These guidelines come from Francis Collins. Through his study of science, he became a Christian because it pointed the way to God. Here's what he says. He says, God reveals himself in and through the world he created. A created world that displays his glory and power and divine nature. And properly interpreted, Scripture and nature are complementary witnesses to that common author. He also says one other thing that's also plain to see and should be plain to see is all people have sinned against God and are in need of salvation. There's nothing in science that speaks against the historical incarnation of Jesus Christ as being fully God and fully man. And it is his historical death and resurrection by which everyone is saved and reconciled to God. God is directly involved in the lives of people today through acts of redemption and transformation and even answers to prayer. And God sustains the world through faithful, consistent processes that humans describe as scientific laws. They also affirm that God works outside the natural world and sometimes supernatural events, including miracles. In both natural and supernatural ways, God continues to be directly involved in creation. The methods of science are an important and reliable means to describe the world that God has made. They reject the ideas such as materialism that claim science is the sole source of knowledge and truth, or that science has debunked God and religion. I'm going to admit that there were times in the history when Galileo was kind of fighting against was a church that had overstepped and had grown a little drunk with power. And if you don't think that that same tendency is not with the world of science, let me just gently suggest you have not been watching the news for the last year. And you really haven't been watching news the last 2 weeks. As in the name of this almighty science, all kinds of purposeful misdirections, and we'll just say fibbing has taken place. We should also believe that God created the universe, the earth, and life, and God continues to sustain the existence and functioning of the natural world. And the cosmos continues to declare the glory of God. They reject the ideas that the universe is self-sustaining, that God is no longer active, and is just as pulled back from history. And we are created in biological continuity with all earth, but we're also spiritual beings. And God has established this unique relationship with humanity by giving us his image and calling it to an elevated position within the created order. That's a little history, but I want to bring it forward. The last few decades have not been good ones for those who hold to merely a materialistic or scientific understanding of the origins of the earth. They've been fighting a losing battle. Now, I'm going back to when I was, let's say, in junior high, and some of you will recognize this. Here's what they used to teach us on how everything came into being. The earth was created, it evolved, pretty soon it got covered with water, and then the tides started, and you had these shallow tidal pools that were filled with junk and chemicals and goo and all this kind of thing. And then all of a sudden one day, there was a lightning bolt, and all of a sudden hit the puddle, and life was created. And by the way, if that sounds familiar to you, it should. It's a plot line in one of a major movie of some 50 years ago. They claimed that this just happened. Something came from nothing. And as a result, we had this divide, and people of faith pulled away and said, no, God did it. And we had this battle that still in some places exists between God on one side and science on the other. And it says that the twain shall never meet. if there is a God, and that God is the creator, any science will lead back to God. There's one problem with this random selection of life argument. You ready for it? DNA.
Yes.
Let me talk about that just for a second. There's another verse in Psalms that says, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Let me tell you how. DNA is not just a twisted helix. It is a conveyor of information. In this twisted helix, there are these ladders, rungs. And each of those rungs on each side has a code. It's one of four different markers, and only four. They've identified as A, T, C, and G. What those stand for is not really important. Even the simplest of cells, that information tells it what kind of cell it is, what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to reproduce, what its function is. Everything about the cell is governed by information. When you turn on your television today, in the old days, those of you under a certain age, in the old days we used to turn on our TV and we'd have the rabbit ear antenna, and then sometimes the picture would start to roll. And I don't know how else to explain it. And then you'd have to go and you'd either adjust the antenna, or there's that horizontal hold knob on the TV, and you'd have to fiddle with it to get that screen to stabilize. And then sometimes at night, you had what these are called a doppelganger effect. You'd see Archie Bunker and Edith, and then you'd see their shadow over here. That's not what your TV does now. Everything your TV does is broken down into zeros and ones. Every movement, every color, it tells where to go on the TV, and then this digital code, it recreates all those pictures because of a digital code. That would be like me walking through a jungle and stumbling upon a 52-inch television currently showing a Bears-Packers game, and me stepping up the TV and go, wow, this is fantastic that science has spontaneously created this television showing a Packers game. Every single cell in your body, even though it's microscopic, you have to get a microscope to show each cell. And the DNA in that cell is smaller still, it's microscopic. But if we could take the DNA out of every little microscopic cell and stretch it out, every cell in your body has 6 feet of a DNA strand filled with this genetic code that's telling it everything. This cell comes into being, your hair, you're part of the chest wall, your kidney, you're the kneecap. Tells it where to go, what to do, what its properties are. It's all in that code. Ready for something else? If you took every cell in your body and all the DNA from every cell in your body and put it end to end, each one of you, your DNA strands in your body would stretch from one end of the solar system to the other end of the solar system and back again. Orbit of Neptune to orbit of Neptune. I guess that's what they mean. I don't know about Pluto. I'm not up to date whether it's a planet, not a planet, all that kind of stuff. But from Neptune on one side to Neptune on the other side and back again in your body. Filled with this genetic code. A, T, G, C, T, G, C, A, C, whatever that code is. What people who have a materialistic view want you to believe is lightning bolt hit a puddle. And you have this very advanced genetic code. You show me a code, and I'll show you someone who's behind the code. That's why the materialistic world's off to a bad start the last 40 years. It's not random, but an organized sequence of information. When you have organized language, it always points to a mind, a designer. I could take, remember the old typewriters? Put a typewriter in the middle of a chicken coop and the chickens would peck at it randomly. You put 100 chickens around the typewriter and 2 weeks later you come back and you get Tolstoy's War and Peace. Something's up. When you have this code, something's up. In places around the world, we have dozens of radio telescopes. I think they're big fields like New Mexico. Those gigantic dishes pointed toward all the matter of outer space, listening for any repeated code. If it's any repeating sound, they go, aha, there's intelligent life. If they hear dot, dot, dash, dot, dot, dash, dot, dot, dash, there's life out there sending us a signal. And yet you have billions and billions of finely tuned genetic code that's instructing each cell exactly what to do, when to do it, and we go, random access. No. And by the way, the leading scientists in this field, many of them were not before, are being led back to a Christian faith because of what they're finding. We have the most intricate information code in front of us, and yet there are those who say, nothing to see here, move along. 50 years ago, the momentum was with people who said, science explains everything. In 2021, the momentum is, hang on here, no it doesn't. Which is why I have nothing to fear from any scientists, because any legitimate science that seeks to view life will lead back to a mind of a creator. The heavens declare the glory of God, and shout the Lord from his hands. And even though you got a knee that's causing you problems and this shoulder hurts and it's bad week, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And you've been made with purposeful intentionality. We have nothing to fear. We have nothing to fear from any ruler. We have nothing to fear from any dictator. We have nothing to fear from any disease. We have nothing to fear from any science. Because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, and the Creator is worthy of my worship.